Oh, good, you're here. I just learned the coolest thing and I want to tell you about it. Today we're going to talk about the Electoral College. Is it DEI for the small states in the South? Well, no, because DEI is generally a good thing that promotes progress and equality, and the Electoral College does not do that. Now, the joke is that Republicans say if it wasn't for this thing called the Electoral College, they would never win a presidential election again. And in fact, they've lost the popular vote every single cycle since George W. Bush was elected. George W. Bush, whose silence during this election cycle and failure to endorse a candidate, he is the only president who has refused to endorse Kamala, is about as scary as those frickin' clowns he paints. Those are creepy, man. How can you commit to painting creepy clowns with more gusto than voting against a creepy clown? But I digress. Here's a quick refresher on what the Electoral College is. Presidential elections are determined in the United States by something called the Electoral College, which isn't like a college you can actually go to. It's a process that helps us elect a president and vice president. The process itself is a little confusing as it was created all the way back in 1787, but I think that I can explain it to you in 3 quick steps. 1. Your vote, when you go in the ballot box, that's called the popular vote. And each state is supposed to take their state's popular vote and use a middleman called an elector to make the ultimate vote for who will be president. Why? Why do we need a middleman? Because in 1787, rich old landowners that voted thought that the public was too stupid to vote directly for the president. Genuinely. That's why we have the Electoral College. And the smaller states were like, we produce a lot of value via our slave labor, and yet we are only getting 1 vote per person. Well, per white person. And that's not fair. It needs to be more fair. We produce a lot of value. We should have a stronger say in the vote. So to be fair to the states, they decided that they would put this middleman in called the elector, and that group of people would be the ones who ultimately vote for the president, not the people directly. Now, how do you become an elector? Because I thought, I want to be an elector. That sounds like a lot of power and pretty cool. Electors are people who are chosen by each state's political party to cast a vote for whoever receives the highest number of votes in that state. They truly are the middleman of the election cycle. Now, there are 538 electors in any given election, and a candidate has to get 270 Electoral College votes to win the appropriate number required to become president. If they don't make it to 270, well, that's another video. How an elector is chosen varies from state to state as well. It's not an elected position, it's an appointed position. And the state's political party conventions either nominate people to be electors that will end up on the state's ballot, or the electors get decided by the political party voting for them. And electors are almost always party loyalists or big donors. And how many electors a state gets is determined sort of by the population, but we're going to get into that. Every state, plus the District of Columbia, is given a certain number of electoral votes, which is proportional to the population of that state and equal to however many congresspeople and senators the state has. So I can explain this by showing you how it works in, let's say, Alaska. Alaska is one of the biggest land masses in the United States, yet there are less than 750,000 residents. Therefore, they only have 2 senators, as all the states do, and 1 congressperson representing the whole of Alaska. That gives them 3 electors in the electoral process. Contrast that with California, who has a population of 39 million. They also only have 2 senators, but they get a whopping 52 congresspeople to represent their districts, which makes for 54 electors in California alone. Now, the math on how each elector represents the will of the people is a bit wonky since every state is required to have at least 1 representative and not all populations are created equal. Then comes step 2 of the electorate process. There's an actual meeting where the electors vote for president and vice president. It's a different day than election day that you and I go to. This meeting takes place on the first Tuesday after the second Wednesday after the general election, which is an oddly specific date I'm surprised wasn't one of the propositions made by the founding fathers. If a candidate wins in a state in the general election, their potential electors become the state's electors. That's right. They don't know even which slate of electors is going to be making the final decision to vote on the president until after the popular vote is counted for that state. So you and I go in to vote on or before November 5th, and then we find out which slate of electors will be seated for our state. In the state of New York, we know it's probably going to be the Democratic slate of electors. Then those electors go to this other special meeting, and that's where they are supposed to represent the will of the popular vote and vote for the president. This is the case in every single state except Maine and Nebraska, where they like to keep it weird. In those states, they do not have a winner-take-all approach to the Electoral College. They allow each district to have one vote. So like in Nebraska, they have 4 congressional districts. They have 4 Electoral College seats. So each one of those districts gets to vote once. That's how Obama ended up with 1 Electoral College vote out of Nebraska in 2012. Which brings me to, do the electors have to vote the way the people's popular vote told them to? No. If for whatever reason an elector doesn't cast a vote the way the popular vote has leaned, then they become what's known in some circles as a faithless elector, or as my mom would say, a jackamole, which I think she means jackamo, but we'll let her have this one. The final step here is the votes of the electors get counted and certified. This is pretty self-explanatory, but I also have some heart palpitations when I hear the word certification. There's a joint session of Congress that gets held every single presidential election on January 6th. That's right. It is going to be every January 6th for every presidential election from now until forever. And then following that, the votes get counted and certified, and the vice president is the one to certify it. And then on January 20th, we get a shiny new president. Seems simple enough, except I'm sure you have one big question right now. How is this racist, V? You said that this was DEI for the South and the small states. What does that mean? Like, how is this racist? I'm not seeing the racism. Because old white slave-owning, land-owning dudes made it up during a hot, sweaty summer session, and because they were too hot and wanted to adjourn Congress to shake out their wigs and air out their undeodorized pits, they decided, hey, why don't we do this thing called the Electoral College instead of really thinking about how we want to vote for the president from now until forever? Let's travel to that rank swamp-ass day in history, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. You see, the states were a relatively new thing back in 1787. We were only 11 years old. We were not a girl, not yet a woman. The country was on a precipice of a very painful puberty, and it needed a little bit of guidance. And then here comes Thomas Jefferson, and he wanted the newly minted United States Congress to decide on leadership in a way that wasn't like the way that the monarchy was decided. And it was his belief that, and I'm paraphrasing here, most people are too stupid to vote for the president. They have no knowledge of their character or qualifications, and we really just can't trust them to vote for the leader of the free world. Which, on one hand, is pretty fair. Literacy was not a top priority back in the 1700s for most people. And a lot of the newspapers didn't reach into the rural areas where most people were living and would eventually be voting for the president. So in lieu of improving the systems of communication, Thomas Jefferson decided just the city boys should be a voter. Now, I am not giving Thomas Jefferson any credit here at all. He was a prolific participant in human trafficking. He is said to have enslaved more than 700 people in his lifetime, and he fought very hard to expand the reach of slavery in the United States. So maybe he's not the best judge of character of what would make for a good voter, and was very much more likely, in fact, trying to just enslave more people to his will. Just a thought. Now, other founding fathers were also concerned with Jefferson's pitch, this idea that Congress would elect the president, saying that Congress could collude with a weak leader who was the president-elect to grant themselves more power. Would the president feel like he owed Congress a few favors if those were the people voting for him? Is this the plot of a mob movie? What even is a mob movie? I'm a 36-year-old farmer and grandfather in rural Virginia. None of this seems right. The world is crazy, right? This is the world they were living in. Everything was like brand new to them. Speaking of grandfathers, on my father's side, we go back to Charles Carroll, who's like very popular in Maryland and who very much hated Thomas Jefferson. A hate that lives on in me to this day. Gramps, we should have never given that macaroni and cheese eating, French wine slurping son of a slaver an inch of power, Gramps. Now look what we suffer with. My 8 times Grandpa Carroll had another frenemy, James Wilson, who is also very much a part of how we ended up with the Electoral College. Now, when you think about your favorite band, let's go with like the Beatles. You can name all of them pretty easily, right? It's like John, Paul, George, Ringo, boom, there's the Beatles. Except the Beatles had a drummer before Ringo named Pete Best, sometimes known as the Forgotten Beatle. It's kind of how the founding fathers are, right? We've got George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Charles Carroll. Maybe you'll forget John Jay like I almost did, but there are quite more founding fathers than that. And right here at the bottom of that list of founding fathers is none other than poor forgotten James Wilson. the Pete Best of founding fathers. But James Wilson had some ideas. Early on, Wilson wanted the executive branch to have a single magistrate who had a very clearly defined separation of power from Congress and the other branches of government. I'm liking that. Early on, he pitched the idea of a national popular vote, meaning that all people would decide on the leader through the powers of democracy. Hooray! Oh, right. All people except women, Black Americans, Native Americans, a person of color of any kind, immigrants, folks who didn't own property, or Jewish people. Right. Despite his best intentions for a national popular vote, James Wilson had no riz, and he folded on his quest for the popular vote to be the way that we vote for the president. And through a series of other compromises like the one Wilson made, the Electoral College was created and has largely been attributed to James Madison, who also wrote the Second Amendment, to give you an idea of how thorough this guy was when writing. Anyway, the Electoral College became a thing, and we all lived happily ever after, and the system was never exploited for nefarious reasons. Oh, who am I kidding? Of course it was. But the racism, I know, I get it. I hear you. You're like, I don't get it. How is the system racist? White women couldn't vote either. How is that racist? Well, let's talk about the 3/5 compromise and how it almost immediately led to the Electoral College being weaponized. Weaponized mostly to exploit the enslaved. Pretty early on, a very nefarious question was asked by the U.S. Congress that went something like this. What are we going to do with all these enslaved people, and how can we use them to manipulate the new voting system without allowing them to actually vote? Yes, that was the legitimate concern for the Founding Fathers due to the ideological divide between the states that allowed slavery and states that didn't allow slavery. The big question when deciding on electors boiled down to whether enslaved people should count in the numbers population or if they should count as something else. They straight up asked, are enslaved people people or are they property? Can property vote? If property can vote, then can cattle vote? They all provide value to the United States. Maybe cattle should vote. Back in 1887, a whopping 40% of people who lived in the South were enslaved, and they could not vote. And in Virginia, that number was 60% of the population. If enslaved people could vote, well, they might think about voting for their freedom. And then what? Thomas Jefferson might have to pay a living wage to his workers, cut back on all those trips to France, cut back on the affairs and the silk stockings he was so fond of. He wanted a way around this, and he did it with the 3/5 compromise, where 3/5 of enslaved Black Americans were counted not only towards calculating federal taxes and establishing state budgets, but toward how many electors a state would get. So guess how many electors this gave the state of Virginia in a system that at the time had room for only 91 electors. So there's 91 total electors to represent the whole United States at that point. Guess how many Virginia got with 60% of its population enslaved? 12, which is 1/4 of 46, the number of votes that someone needed to win the presidency back then. But enslaved people still couldn't vote. They were simply represented by the master's vote in the Electoral College. As Akil Reed Amar soberly explains for Time magazine, after the 1800 census, Wilson's free state of Pennsylvania had 10% more free persons than Virginia, but got 20% fewer electoral votes. Perversely, the more slaves Virginia or any other slave state bought or bred, the more electoral votes it would receive. Were a slave state to free any blacks who moved to the north, the state could actually lose electoral votes. He then goes on to point out that for 32 of the Constitution's first 36 years, a white slave-owning Virginian occupied the presidency. Southerner Thomas Jefferson, for example, won the election of 1800 against Northerner John Adams in a race where the slavery skew of the Electoral College was the decisive margin of victory. Without the Electoral College votes generated by slavery, the mostly Southern states that supported Jefferson would not have sufficed to give him a majority. As pointed observers remarked at the time, Thomas Jefferson metaphorically rode into the executive mansion on the back of his slaves. And so here we are now in 2024 using a system that was created by a group of human traffickers who were perversely too naive to see the evolution of party politics in America. And yet the Electoral College has endured. It was out for decades before white women got the vote in 1920. Before poll taxes were eliminated. And remember, Black women did not get the right to vote in this country freely until 1965. Back in September of 2024, the fine folks at Pew Research Center polled Americans on the Electoral College and found that, quote, more than 6 in 10 Americans, or 63%, would instead prefer to see the winner of the presidential election be the person who wins the most votes nationally. So what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? Well, first, We could get a constitutional amendment to replace the system as 63% of Americans claim they want it to be. But aside from an amendment being hard to pull off, as we discussed earlier, there's also the issue of partisanship. The Harvard Political Review states that only 47% of Republicans or Republican-leaning voters support changing the Electoral College. Now, this is expected given that most pollsters see Republican candidates lose the popular vote, but win the Electoral College than the other way around. I mean, that's how Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. She won the popular vote by over 2 million more votes, but he won the Electoral College. And with Republicans controlling at least one legislative body in 33 states, passing such an amendment seems highly unlikely without radical change in political opinion. So we're just not there yet. Now, there is a second path to get away from the Electoral College, and path number 2 is what I like to call the Civil War contrarian method, also known as the path of mistakes. This would solve for few of the issues with the so-called battleground states, but it would open up a litany of other issues relating to home team advantages. Meaning, as Harvard Political Review puts it, states like California with a dominant party may be reluctant to change a system that has consistently worked in their favor. Meaning, as the Harvard Political Review puts it, many states like California with a dominant party, the Democrats in this case, could be reluctant to change the system that has consistently worked for them, especially if all the other states keep their winner-take-all system. Such a proposition only stands to lose the dominant party's crucial electoral votes, and as you know, California's got 52 of those bad boys. Now, there is a third option available. It is not likely. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, or NPVIC. This proposed act was introduced back in 2006 as a potential means of adopting national popular votes. Quote, the NPVIC operates on a simple premise. It requires participating states to allocate their electoral votes to the presidential candidate who wins the national popular vote, regardless of the state-level results. So the MPVIC has actually been adopted by 17 U.S. states with a total of 209 potential electoral votes that would support the initiative. It's not enough because, as you know, the president has to get to 270. And the thing that this does is it kind of allows everybody to vote at the popular vote, right? And then have their electors take a look at the way their state went, but eventually hand power over to the larger mass. And I don't know that the states are going to want to do that. I think that there's still a lot of states' rights people out there that are going to say, my state voted this way, and I want to see it represented. I don't want to compromise again in that electoral college space. So biggest problem with the NPVIC is that it's pending in 10 states and it has been for nearly 2 decades. We haven't seen any movement on it. So it is incredibly unlikely that the NPVIC would ever go through. Now, major leaps and innovations have been made to U.S. law and the Electoral College over the past several centuries, and it cannot be undersold what a symbolic victory it is that the system that was built to exploit enslaved people and to artificially inflate a population to which the voices of the enslaved did not matter is now going to be responsible for an election with a woman of color as a major party candidate who could very likely win this election. I'm sure the Founding Fathers were not counting on Kamala Harris when they wrote up this legislation. They did not see the phenomenon coming. Now, we may not be able to bank on this idea that the Electoral College can someday be abolished. But what we can do is pay attention to the many ways the system has been exploited to better arm ourselves in elections with the knowledge that it can and will be exploited again. And we can vote in every election, filling in every single bubble. So what do you think? Electoral College or popular vote? Or burn it all down and start over? Constitutional convention in this economy? You are writing a check for our divided and often dysfunctional Congress that we will never be able to cash.